All right, I'm here today with Dr. Bracy Hill. He's a senior lecturer at Baylor in history, and I first came across him on the Meat Eater podcast with Steve Rinella. He was talking about Christianity and hunting. Is hunting a sin? Is hunting compatible with conservationism? And most interestingly, all the stories in the Bible and references to hunting and to meat eating. So, Dr. Hill, welcome.
Hey, thanks, Dr. Marsh. Appreciate it.
So I enjoyed your interview with Steve Rinella on the Meat Eater podcast, and y'all were talking about Nimrod and Cain and Abel, Jacob and Esau, God as a hunter. And
Right.
on that format, y'all went through a lot of topics, but I felt there could be so much more done, especially on these biblical passages. And so I reached out to you, and you agreed to this interview. And I want to, if you're okay with it, to go through these passages, especially in Genesis, and talk about hunting from a Christian point of view.
Sure.
First of all, how did you get into, obviously you're a hunter, but how did you get into, writing a book and getting into the research of it? By the way, the name of his book is God, Nimrod, and the World, Exploring Christian Perspectives on Sport Hunting. What's the origin of this book?
I was writing a dissertation, and I was bored. If you've ever written a dissertation, there comes that moment when you just despise your subject matter. And mine was a huge dissertation. I think it came in right at 650 pages. So somewhere along that process, around 2007, I was walking across campus with my mentor, a fellow his name is Dr. David Bevington. He's at the University of Stirling. He's a historian there, but particularly focuses on evangelicalism and religious history. And we were walking across campus, and I made a comment that my wife and I had hunted on the property of a fellow that he knew, and that my wife recently had killed her first animal, that she had killed a white-winged dove. And he stopped. He just physically stopped and recoiled from me. And he looked at me, silence, and he said, "That's just so French." And I realized that we were having this very awkward moment, and clearly two cultures, people who were committed Christians and academics, did not only see eye to eye, but we belonged to two different worlds.
Yeah.
And I started thinking about that. I thought, wow, okay. So what I'm doing, is it just American? Or is it not really Christian? And so I began to explore possibilities of when I began to look at apologies and writings on Christianity and hunting, most fell into two different schools of thought. One were those who just kind of...
Before you do the two, can I ask a quick, when he says that's so French, I'm just curious, does he mean French as in vulgar or as the nation of France? I'm just curious. I don't know. I know nothing about hunting in France. I'm just curious by what that means.
Yeah, there's a lot of shooting that goes on in France. A lot of bird hunting.
He means France. Okay.
But he means it again as
vulgar.
a man who went to Cambridge.
Yeah.
He means it in more than just
like
French.
Pardon my French. Yeah. It's a little bit.
We might say that's so redneck.
Gotcha.
If that makes sense.
Gotcha. Okay, so you're going to make two distinctions. Sorry to interrupt. I was just curious about that.
So the two different strings of thought I found when I was looking at the literature, looking at hunting and its validity for Christians, fell into the camps of Andrew Lindsay, who's at Oxford, and has a center there looking at essentially how to treat animals, but particularly it is anti-hunting, pro-animal, and his attack since the 1990s on that movement. The Oxford Center for, I forget the name of it off the top of my head. I'll come up with it. I'll come up in a second. But it's a well-established group, and they have lots of money. So the Oxford Center for Animal Ethics, that's the name of it. So I came across that literature, which was very anti-hunting. It very much saw then and ridiculed ideas of the predator Jesus, in Christianity, allowing for any type of mistreatment of animals, which they saw as hunting, besides, if you will, industrial farming, and I think most anyone would say would be animal abuse, would recoil. But their definition is very broad and very much based on the philosophical and ethical schools that emerged around Tom Reagan and Peter Singer, but with a Christian spin in the 1990s. Yeah. The other school of thought was that, and with No Disdain, those, like, for instance, a fellow by the name of Tom Rakow, and it's very much a kind of read the scriptures, surely the scriptures say this. It mostly comes from evangelical Protestants on the edge of evangelical Protestants. But they're thinking outside the box already. Many times they're independent Christian groups, and they go to university or they go to seminary, and they're utilizing their linguistic education in Greek and Hebrew, the seriousness that they apply to reading scripture and finding truth in it and revelation there, and they turn it then to sports, particularly to hunting. And so you get this apology for why what we do is an acceptable thing. And this very much embraces a kind of dominion theory of the relationship between humans and animals. So looking particularly to Genesis 1 for guidelines, perhaps to the beginning of Genesis 2. And that's how they approach it. It's not that it's not reflective, but it's just as one-sided as the Lindsay group on animal ethics. So
would they go as far as to say on the Dominion side, I mean, like the really crude version of it is, well, God made animals as our toys, so we can do what we want? Is it
in the crudest form? That would be it.
Yeah,
right.
But probably more nuanced.
Right.
Yeah.
And so my concern was, as I began to look at this, was surely it's not that easy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's not that easy. And when I read scripture, it doesn't seem that easy. It seems as though animals are sacrificed, and there are things that would turn most of our stomachs, all in the name of God. And it seems to be the commands of God, particularly when one looks like Levitical laws, etc.
Yeah, I mean, could you imagine if you went back in time to the temple and, like, this is God's liturgy, and it's just killing of animals all day, blood everywhere, flies everywhere, entrails, intestines, hides, meat, all day. I mean, to be a priest was to be a pretty jacked butcher. I mean, you've butchered animals. I've been hunting. I've butchered large animals. It is exhausting.
It is.
It is exhausting to do, especially as your knife gets dull, and the amount of lifting and all the work that goes into it. I mean, I've butchered with like 3 adult men, and we're tired at the end of it. I can't imagine being a Levitical priest and you're sacrificing bulls and sheep all day long. And the blood and the smell.
And I mean, they're not dead either. I mean, so I have pet goats, and when things get bad, unfortunately, I'm responsible, as I am with my other pets, for their end. Mm-hmm. And sometimes that good end means taking their life with my own hands. I try to find the fastest, what we might say most humane, least painful way for them. And to be honest, least painful way for me. But to listen to the screams and the gurgles of animals as their throats are cut and their blood is poured out, and that's your job, and the smell of blood gets, as a priest, and the smell of blood goes up your nose, and the writhing of the animal, I got to say, you got to get pretty hardened. I mean, one thinks of going to chicken factories and people who spend their days killing chickens, again, in the name of God. And so anyway, I read that, and then I think of the world I know and the love that I have for animals and all my pets, rescuing animals. This is one of the things we do. We don't have children. Our children are animals. And it's how does one take those two different realities? How does one take the good shepherd, but then remember at the same moment that the reason you're a shepherd is to raise animals to die?
That's right.
To die either at the altar or to die and find their way to the table. So, anyhow, so I thought, well, you know what? There's no way I can answer this. So I began to assemble scholars and people who weren't that scholarly in some ways to begin to give their perspectives, because I didn't want a one-sided tome. I wanted something that expressed the diversity of approaches to Christianity and to sport hunting, anti-positions, pro-positions. And I gathered, in particular, I was looking at how it also worked with sports. So I gathered athletes who hunted, professional hunters, professional football players, professional baseball players, Sometimes had to help them and work through it. Hunting celebrities, probably the most well-known is Jace Robertson.
Hmm.
We did an essay together. I pulled academics who hadn't written on hunting, but were serious academics who I knew were willing to take on new subject matter and had them explore topic matter. Eventually, I brought in a co-editor to write essentially the anti-piece and bring in his friend to write the key anti-piece. But otherwise, I picked the 24 contributors by hand, called them up, sometimes cold called them, and many times cold called them, and had them work their essays. Took a long time. Started in 2007, and this incarnation started in 2012. I finally found a publisher, and I began to get many of the people that already said yes to start writing essays. And like I said, then brought on a co-editor, and eventually the piece came out then in 2017, twice the size it was supposed to be.
Yeah.
But I believe it's got a lot of things for a lot of people. It's not one of those things that you just simply, it's written and I wove it, I hope, so that it flows from one chapter to the next, one voice to the next. But each voice is radically different. And for many of the readers, I hope each chapter it resonates with different amounts. So some are going to say, that's a great chapter. Others like, I didn't get that.
Right.
But the point is that it makes Christians think about what they do or don't do. Who's their God? How do they relate to each other as Nimrod, that is, as humans? Mm-hmm. And how do they relate to the natural world?
Nice. All right, so let's open up the Bible here.
All right.
Probably the first, well, not probably, the first story in the Bible that talks about killing animals would be Cain and Abel.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Abel's a shepherd, Cain's a farmer.
Right.
And Cain kills Abel because God accepts the sacrifice of Abel. He doesn't accept the sacrifice of Cain. So jealousy is brought into the mix. But there's also this background story that the first humans the Homo sapiens are Homo liturgicus. They're involved in some sort of liturgy, some sort of sacrificial oblation offering to God, the Creator. And there's two forms of that offering. One is plant-based and one is animal-based. And yet you have other people who say, well, not until Noah and the ark were people eating animals. And then you also have the story, which you talked on Steve Rinella's podcast, about Jacob and Esau, right, which is like a pastoralist, Jacob, and then Esau is a hunter.
Right.
So already in the first several chapters of Genesis, up into just past the Abrahamic epic of Jacob and Esau, you have these tensions of food sources, liturgy, offerings to the Lord, human diet. And then that whole kind of Genesis 1 through 11 ends with, or begins again with Nimrod, who's called a great hunter. So what's going on here? I mean, what's the etiology? Let's start with Cain and Abel.
Well, you can't.
Yeah, there's not much there.
You got to start with Genesis 1.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Yes, okay.
Okay, so first off, if you've ever read Genesis 1 through, well, let's just say the first 11 chapters. Yeah. Sometimes you're like, is this the same story? Where did they get wives?
Yes.
How did that work out? And how many animals did he take on the ship?
Yeah.
Was the ark 2 by 2, or what are these 7 clean animals?
Right.
I thought it was 2 by 2. Okay, so the first thing we have to talk about, in my opinion, and first off, caveat, I have degrees in theology. I am not a biblical scholar, but I've taken classes and I've spent a good portion of my life playing with this for both intellectual kind of exercise, but also for spiritual exercise. So these are my comments, and I guarantee you'll find 99 scholars who don't agree with me and don't agree with each other on how to interpret this. So first off, if we start with Genesis 1, because that's how the canon comes together.
Yep.
So even though it seems at times like it's pieces stuck together, and I would think it is, there still is this intentionality of the construction of the canon. So we have to take the whole canon. So what do we get? You have in the beginning, well, that's right, that's how it begins. You have in the beginning a creation story which is very symmetrical. Genesis 1 through Genesis 2, I think it's verse 4. So you have these construction of or formation of parts of the world, and then so you've got 3 days, And then the next 3 days, you get animals that then correspond by way of what they consume and where they live. You've got light, and you have birds and waterfowl, pardon me, you have birds, and then you have those things in the water. And then on the last day, you have creeping things in the earth and humans.
Yeah, and they correspond to the land.
And they correspond to the land. Right. And then you get the seventh day God rests. Okay. So what you get there is humans and animals at the same time.
Right.
Clearly, it's all good. And of course, in Genesis 1, you have the creation of humans, and there's no differentiation between the creation, if you will, of male and female. He created them both, male and female. In Genesis 2, you have another story. Now, I mean, you can try and work together and blend them, or you can simply say this is another origin story that gets at the heart of the matter. So if you listen to the Ranella podcast, I'm sure some people kind of went crazy when I said, hey, look, this is a myth. Right. And by myth, I mean a story that undergirds, explains what a culture believes. It creates their worldview, and they pass it on and retell it to subsequent generations. Yeah. It is true to them. Not that they may believe it was 24-hour days. They may have. But when they look at it, this is what it means to be me. I believe this, and this is my story. Right. Just like when we tell stories around family reunions or Christmas time or at the hunting camp. Yep. We tell the stories that identify us, many times differentiate us from other, and define who we are, not only in regards to each other around the campfire, around the service, around the congregation, around the family table at the reunion, but it also forms us and helps us answer questions that the story doesn't immediately answer. Yeah. It shapes our imagination.
And when we tell stories, we're not always just saying, hey, here's like 12 facts I wanted you to know. When we tell a story, like at a hunting camp or on a camp out or whatever it is in these more intimate gatherings, we're trying to take a human concept, a human analogy, a human metaphor, and apply it so that the people around us also...
Exactly. Something we can't fully put our hands around. The divine.
And like you use the word myth, and I think a lot of my own listeners are going to recoil against that as well. But it's maybe to help define it would be like C.S. Lewis says that in the Christian story, myth becomes reality.
Exactly.
Right. And so, I think we can get into debates like, did the snake have vocal cords when he spoke to Eve? The accounts also says that God brought the animals from the earth. Did they physically come out of the dirt? Did when God blew through with his nostrils a soul, was it really wind? And there's these things in there, these technical elements that we can get really bogged down into, and it's hard to answer any of those questions. But we can't. But the narrative is obviously telling us something important about God's relationship to creation, man's relationship to the animal kingdom, rest. Male, female, etc.
As I was explaining also in that podcast, so what we get is an exciting, and what I consider to be an exciting revelation about God. And that is, God allows us to use our imaginations. That means apparently our minds and our brains are not defunct, that they're not twisted, that they're open to God's revelation. Think about it. Jesus speaks in parables.
Right.
And he doesn't explain them all.
Yeah.
Which leaves them open to interpretation. So the incarnate God chooses to explore the ultimate truths about how we're to relate to each other, how we're definitely supposed to relate to our Father, which he gives us this as an example. Yeah. But he doesn't give us the answers. Right. He gives us stories.
Yeah. And with parables, you can nitpick them and break them all apart, right? But ultimately, our Lord's telling us a parable to get across the analogy, the metaphor, the principle, the doctrine. Exactly. Yeah.
So you get all these stories, and the more stories you have from a culture, the more stories we have from Jesus, the more we can begin to understand the other stories. Because in theory, they're consistent.
Yes.
Because they define a worldview.
Yes.
So back to Genesis. So we look for consistencies. We look for the message that makes the way through the stories that at times seem almost contradictory. Genesis 1 says, animals were good, humans were very good, this world is good, and it's all from God's own mind and own desire. Genesis 2. There is man. Man is God's creation from the dust. So it's not ex nihilo.
Right.
Neither the earth nor humans. They all come from something. God starts with something and makes it much, much, much more. And humans are much, much more.
He derives the complex from the lower. It's definitely a principle there for the animals and for the human.
And so because man, literally, man-ish, does not have his fullness yet, God creates a complement that's with an E. And he does so to make this helpmate, which God himself frequently calls himself. Yeah. And it's someone who saves somebody else's behind many times or helps them accomplish what they need. And he creates animals out of the dust. And it's fascinating to remind ourselves, so is this all the animals or is it just the animals of the garden? I'll let somebody figure that one out. But nonetheless, it's animals. And humans find animals not to be exactly what they need, but apparently God thought they were important enough. Yeah. And he has man name the animals that are created in the presence of man. And that naming is generally seen as a kind of an authority. It's something that God does. God names. Right. Humans get to name. But it doesn't necessarily say, and have dominion. That's Genesis 1. Right. It's just name.
Yeah. It's interesting, too, here to think about what is said and what is not said. God does not say, and now let's name the vegetables.
No.
So animals get a special place in this created world. Man gets to name them. Vegetables, man eventually does name them, but it's not part of this divine act. Or this divine...
Well, there are two vegetables, not really, but you get it. Yeah, there are two trees.
The trees, yeah.
And God names them.
Yeah.
Interestingly enough. Mm-hmm. So God names them, and one is good, and one is both are good.
Right.
You're just not supposed to partake of one of them.
Yeah.
The tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So anyhow, God makes, of course, woman from man, and again, we see this, if you want to, complexity that comes then from a good creation, and then they're placed in the garden. What seems to be, of course, a idyllic environment. What do? That's a good question. Do they till the earth? Are they just gatherers? It's not real clear to me. Although when we see at the curse at the end, that the earth will no longer bring forth the things that are desirable. It'll bring forth things that are desirable and thorns and thistles, and you won't get 100% yield, essentially. Yep. So maybe they were tilling. Yeah. They were caring for it. So they're tossed out of the garden because of their decision making. There is a snake in there. If you want to roll with the snake, you can.
Yeah. Does he have vocal cords? Right. But yeah, in the Christian tradition, it's the devil.
Yeah. Satan. But it's not said that. It's a snake. That's what the story says. A snake.
Originally is a snake.
It's not until later on, hundreds of years later, likely in Jewish tradition, that you begin to see the snake then identified as Satan. Yeah. Satan himself, if you recall from Job, is not the devil.
Right.
He's just the prosecuting attorney.
Yeah, he's the accusing angel. Mm-hmm.
Right. So we have this, what seems to be, and again, I'm stepping back as a historian, we have this evolution of ideas. One could say ongoing revelation, however you want to do it, that makes its way into the canon. So then at the end, we have Adam and Eve. Eve is cursed, and it's a horrible curse. She's going to have more pain in childbirth, and she will desire her husband. Right. I mean, that sucks. Okay. I mean, and the guy is going to work.
Yeah, by the sweat of his brow.
By the sweat of his brow, and the yield would be less than he wants. And the earth, in that sense, is also cursed.
Yeah.
So the earth will bring forth that which is not good.
Right.
So the
and
earth.
Interestingly, the earth is what Adam was brought from. So
exactly
all these things,
yeah. Then we have this break to Cain and Abel. So Adam had known his wife, and we all know what I think the verb is yada in Hebrew means to know, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
But it doesn't seem to be a negative thing. It's just he's intimate with her, and that's appropriate. And they have two children, Cain and Abel. One is tied to the raising of animals, and the way it's phrased is like smaller animals, like goats, sheep, small cattle. And then Cain he does agriculture.
Right.
So you have whether nomadic or not, you have a animal-based culture and you have a domesticated agricultural culture, which is going to be sedentary,
Yep.
that are represented in these two characters. And God chooses, he doesn't accept Cain's.
Yeah.
It's not a zero-sum game. It's just he rejects Cain's and accepts Abel's. And why? No one knows, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Any argument is going to be open to serious
Right. Because we could say God prefers blood atonement, which we know later in Genesis. We know it especially in Leviticus. But also when you read Leviticus, there are grain offerings, cereal offerings.
Right.
So in the Levitical and wine, and so in the Levitical priesthood, you have an agricultural oblation and a meat blood oblation. So it doesn't seem that when Cain and Abel, God's like, I don't like fruits and veggies on the altar,
right?
Because we know that he does later on.
Yeah, in the New Testament, you get arguments like in Abel, in the lineage of faith, right? In Hebrews, you get Abel's counted among them. It's like, okay, I'm not sure how that worked out, but there it is.
Yeah.
But Cain is given an option. Cain is given the option, look, don't let this get you down. Don't be vengeful. You have a choice. Don't yield to the sin that is waiting, basically, to ambush you. Yeah. So it's fascinating. So
and he gets the mark, and he gets a mark.
Well, he has the knowledge of good and evil first. He has a choice whether or not to do something. And what he does is shed blood. Yeah. He kills his brother in the field. And what's interesting is God says, basically, you're done for. You're cursed. And Cain says, no, but I've got an argument. And God listens to the argument and in some ways lets him live. He lets him live. He gets the mark of protection. Because the irony is, Cain says, anyone who knows about me will kill me. Yeah. The irony here is the farmer who kills becomes the hunted. Yes. It's like the most dangerous game.
Exactly.
And he says, I'm gonna die. They're going to hunt me down.
And there's a presumption that there, it seems, are at least 1 to 2 to 12 to 100 men out there.
Oh, and then we get a transition. Cain suddenly has a wife.
Yes.
How did that happen?
Right.
So if we take these simply as stories that help us understand
and he founds a city.
He does. Nod, I think, or something like that. Which he becomes a wanderer, a vagabond, but then he founds a city. So we have this urban environment associated then with the agricultural lifestyle.
Which is what we see in human history, every culture.
Exactly.
Cities and civilizations are always built on the domestication of agriculture. Always.
When we look, for instance, like at Jericho, Satahayuk in southern Turkey, these places begin to have the domestication of cereals, first and foremost. And then we begin to see small villages, 1 acre to 5 acres develop. They build walls because they have surplus. Yep. And so, of course, you want to keep other people from having what you have. You farm outside the walls, and suddenly the cities, people come to trade because you have surplus and you have specialization of labor. And so suddenly you have an urban environment tied to agriculture, which is sedentary. And you get a very different view of God if you're a farmer than if you're a hunter.
That's right.
And the dominant view of, and this is, again, my perspective, the dominant view of the Hebrew Bible is that of an urban, semi-urban agricultural world. Now, they have domestication of animals, but most of that is just taking place on the outskirts. You don't get a lot of nomadic movement. Abraham, yes.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, if you look at the founding stories, you know, Abraham is a rancher. He's a pastoralist. He has animals. It seems like he has a lot of livestock, but he doesn't seem to be growing any grain. It seems like Jacob and Esau, or not Esau, different, but Jacob has livestock. That epic, that patriarchal epic, seems to be nomadic and rancher. But it seems once you get into the kingdom,
right,
Judges, and then into Saul, David, it's all agricultural.
Yeah,
and there seems to also be a connection between agricultural and paganism. I don't know quite. Probably has to do with fertility cult or something, but it also seems that Israel struggles more with paganism when they're agricultural. Some people have said when you're a nomad, you never set up shrines, you always have kind of this solitary God in the sky that you talk to. Whereas when you're attached to the land, you start having all these problems of pestilence and crops, and you start turning to all sorts of local shrines, local deities. I've heard that said. Don't know if it's true.
Well, I mean, we can posit this just from reason. If you're nomadic, You simply follow what's there. You go find better grass.
Yeah.
If you're a farmer, you don't get an option.
Yeah. You're
God
stuck.
better rain for you, and the sun better come out so it can't be too wet, or we'll end up with fungus on our crops. We got to have a defensive God who fights for us to keep the people from coming to take the stuff that we've grown.
Yep.
So suddenly you're far more dependent on a particular kind of God who's fairly complex at doing a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
When you're nomadic, you pretty much are responsible for your own well-being. And if you look at the stories of Abraham and the like, it's when their greatest points of crisis are when they bump into cities.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's the city people that don't like them.
Yeah.
And so you move from this nomadic existence to an urban environment to eventually a kingdom. Unfortunately, it splits to two kingdoms with massive cities, Jerusalem, which is like Paris. Everybody wants to be in Jerusalem, even if you're not from there. And it's the center of everything. And it's this story that takes you, and of course, who's compiling all this? Urbanites.
Yep. Yeah.
And they're likely compiling this somewhere between the 9th century and the 6th century BCE. And
priests who are urbanite.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Otherwise you have generally a kind of shamanistic environment. Right. If you look at other hunting and gathering types. Yeah. So you get priests who depend upon killing animals for a living, offering what God wants, and they don't do anything other than that. They don't produce. Yeah. So it's a fascinating story. So did Cain and Abel a story of agriculture versus a kind of nomadic, or is it herding? It's hard to tell.
Yeah, it seems herding. I'm thinking herding, pastoral, shepherd.
Right. But if I were to step back from it, I would say the main story I'm supposed to take is don't yield to sin. And correct. God is merciful. He marks Cain and gives Cain blessings. So that has said that God is always faithful, even when we aren't. Right. But there is that little germ in there about the two different aspects of worldviews and economic background that make you wonder. Yeah. There's just not enough data.
Yeah. So really the story from there, we jump to, there's a little bit about Enoch, that's real unusual. Yeah. And then we get to Noah.
Right.
And we have the sons of God going into the daughters of men.
Right. Which is always fun to talk about.
Yeah, two theories. One is, that the righteous men mated with the unrighteous women, and God didn't like that. Or that angels, if you read this in like First Enoch, angels are copulating with humans and creating these giants, these Nephilim. And so God has to do sort of a genocide of those people, these giant nasty guys. And that's what the flood is for. But either way, just like in Adam's story, we have the preservation and this special relationship of animals to the human. Right. Where Adam names the animals. Here, Noah also is getting really personal with these animals. Right. And it seems that in the story that we have this close connection because it's salvific. God is saving humankind. Yep. But along with it, he's saving animal kind. It's like a conservationist tale.
So it's another covenant, right? So you get the first covenant in some ways, which is creation. Yep. And then you get another one, which is, there's lots of little covenants in there, but this big, you can see sometimes they'll call it Noahic
covenant,
Noanic, or something along those lines. The covenant with Noah, and it's a fascinating and inclusive covenant. So one of the questions invariably that gets asked is, were people eating animals prior to this? Okay, so if we read the story as if it were unified, so little stories, but together, that there's this, we're supposed to assume that there's there's something that ties us all together. You don't get an explicit reference to humans that I've come across eating animals. Now, there is a character, descendant of Cain, if I remember correctly, whose name is Jabal, who is the ancestor of cattle raisers and the like. You think, well, why is he in there?
Yeah, he's the
and
cow-
what are they eating in these cities?
He's the cowboy,
Yeah, so my logic is, they're eating animals.
Yeah.
But it's not said. Those who particularly argue...
why is Abel raising livestock just to get the wool. It seems that, especially if he's, the idea of a sacrifice is you kill the sacrifice, you offer it to God, and then you eat it.
Right.
Like the Passover lamb. You kill it, you offer it to God, then you eat it. So it seems that if Abel was offering a liturgical sacrifice to God, he would then consume part of the flesh to ratify the covenantal relationship. That's how we look back on it.
Right.
And that's how I think that's how a Jew would read it. If you're doing sacrifices, you're going to eat the flesh. So that's
you've got another giving of if you remember, of course, after the eating of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and the recognition of being naked, we have God step in and provide. First off, you've got fig leaves going on, which are big leaves. I got a fig tree outside my window. There's big leaves. But God provides skins. So presumably an animal died.
Yes.
Unless God creates just skins out of the dust. An animal dies for the sake of humanity. Yeah,
it seems that God is acting as a priest. Some sort of sacrifice was made, and then Adam and Eve are covered with these animal skins as breeches, it says, some kind of shorts.
So there's some shorts, I don't think they'll ever come back in style quite.
Leather shorts.
Leather shorts. Yeah. Lord, that's the 80s.
Yeah.
So you've got the loss of life there. You have the presumed loss of life with the story of the animal provided by Abel. Unless he just simply brought this little lamb, which was the best, and just sat it out there while it quietly called for its mother, it seems as though there's a sacrifice. So we've had loss of life. It just doesn't say that has become a part of human diet. But what we know, of course, from archaeology and anthropology, when you have these urban environments, they're domesticating animals. We already have domesticated animals. They're not just keeping them for ritualistic sacrifice, right, for cultic practice. So logic says they're eating. But then we have this destruction of the population. There's lots of ancient Near Eastern myths around the area that give parallels. But the story of Noah is always just a little bit different. It's not quite like the Atrahasis story. It's not like the flood story, which is embedded in the Gilgamesh epic. It's got its own agendas. And one of those is the covenant at the end. So God saves humans. But he doesn't just save humans and recreate animals. He saves animals which were good in the first place and brings them along. And then once the flood has receded, God makes a promise. God makes a covenant. And it's not something like, here's a deal, you do this, I'll do this, and we're good. God says unilaterally, this is the way it is. All right, here we go. Here's the earth. And the language then is, because it is unilateral, it's very much a blessing then on humanity, but a blessing on animals. I will not destroy the world and you ever again by flood. It's not going to happen. He does then go on and say, and don't kill each other. There's the crime and a penalty.
Yep.
And then he says,
this is really the death penalty is established here.
Yeah, if you want to run that way, I think you can make an argument.
Yeah.
But then he also makes animals responsible for their own crimes, which is interesting. But he gives humans permission to eat animals. And I almost should read this, but I feel like I should be whipping out the Bible there, which I have one. But nonetheless, you get this permission to do it. And what's fascinating then is that, of course, the earth, which has been flooded, the animals whose lives have at least some of their species have been destroyed, and then humans, part of their species have been destroyed, are all given a promise. And that promise is not to A, B, and C. It's all integrated.
Yeah.
Which is not unlike many of the eschatological prophecies that we see, for instance, in Isaiah and Ezekiel, where all of the earth, animals...
It's a creation
humans,
covenant.
It is.
Yeah, and some people even said that subsequent covenant, for example, the Noahic covenant, is really just a reiteration of the original Adamic covenant, the Adam covenant, right?
But it's explicit. I mean, it says to a degree that animals are responsible for their actions.
Yep.
In theory, and of course, there's Levitical law that you'd say, where does that fit into it? Aren't they doing what they're supposed to be doing? And that is being predatory. And the answer seems to be yes. There's no real argument in the rest of the Bible.
Like if a bull gores a person, the bull gets stoned.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is that a question about the crime and a will of the animal, or is that an issue
I
of,
don't
I don't
I
know.
don't know, but
That's the
there
best
is
example. Yeah.
capital punishment for animals in Levitical law.
And if your bull has gored someone before or been a problem, then not only does the bull get gored, you get, pardon me, get stoned. You
Yeah,
get stoned.
you're responsible as well.
Yeah,
And then
you're
also in
responsible.
another element of animal culpability, if we want to call it that, is in Jonah when Nineveh repents, the animals also fast and
They
repent.
do. So you get a fascinating
Yeah,
kind of, uh, again, it's different ways to interpret it, but you do see this porousness between human animals and non-human animals.
right.
There's a relationship. It's not A over B.
Hmm.
They both are interconnected in God's creation and ongoing goodwill towards this world which He created. So the focus is, now this is where I begin to develop, so working at the theology of hunting is, so how then do we view this act, which is itself a blood sport? It's violent.
Yeah,
And the question comes up then is the animal equal to humanity? Is the animal to be used? Is
yeah,
the animal, if it is to be used properly in a particular sense? What integrity, what value should be placed upon the animal? Is it simply utility? It provides food for me, it provides clothing, or is it something more than that? It's a good thing. It never lost its goodness. It never lost the fact that it came from God's imagination, God's own desire, God's own will to somehow complement the rest of creation. It wasn't just simply made for us, it was also made for the grasses and the grains. The birds eat certain things, the land animals eat certain things. There's this complementary character to
right.
all of
And they
creation,
eat each other.
and they eat each other.
Yeah,
I mean, again, grass is alive,
yeah,
trees are alive. There is life that I can't make. I can take a seed and do
hmm,
something with it, but I can't make that.
yeah,
It seems to have this divine origin. I can't create it from nothing. I have to depend upon something that exists before. So if you look at it from a kind of evolutionary standpoint, I don't even think you have to use that term, but a natural standpoint is nothing exists without eating something else. In the
if
end,
it's alive.
if it's alive.
Yeah, life
And
needs to consume life.
yeah, and when we stop consuming life,
We
we
die.
get eaten.
We die. Yeah,
We get
and then, yeah, then things eat us.
Yeah, exactly.
Bacteria,
Exactly.
buzzards, whatever it is.
Beetles,
Yeah.
eventually worms. I mean, if there's a fascinating story, if you've read the Gilgamesh epic, Gilgamesh's buddy Enkidu, who they've gone on adventures, etc., dies of illness for the hubris against Ishtar. And for that, then, when Enkidu dies, Gilgamesh sees death in someone who sees his equal, and it's when the worm crawls out of Enkidu's nose that he's been still for a while, but that corruption of being consumed by something else that rocks Gilgamesh's world. He has this existential crisis, and he has to go on a quest to try and find immortality, which he doesn't.
Right.
We get consumed, and
Yeah.
there's a focus we have on that. I mean, even you like read the Venerable Bede, right? You know the person was a saint because their body turned out to be, when they dug them up, oh wow, it didn't seem to be consumed.
Right.
We don't want,
Incorrupted. Yeah.
yeah, we don't want to be consumed. We
No.
really don't.
Which is why we
Whatever.
have burial. We're trying
Exactly.
to. We either want to prevent it or just not see it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which is pretty much what modern society has done.
Yeah.
And one of the, I think what takes some of the theology that takes hunting seriously and trying to find a kind of virtue quality to it says that one of the things that's beneficial about hunting, if it's done properly, is that it recognizes in the act of taking another life, hopefully in an ethical fashion, humanely, and that is in regards to not causing as much pain as possible, and to be consumed, not just simply for the act of killing, that one recognizes one's own mortality in a way that is impossible to recognize any other way, that there's a tragedy that takes place, and out of that tragedy, we are transformed for the better.
Right.
We participate in a system that is as old as time, and in doing so, we become more human. And in that moment, we also recognize the limitations of our power, and we recognize then our need. Where you don't get that if you don't see death. If you simply sweep your dead off to die in hospitals, it's sanitized, they get shipped off to morgues, they get shipped off then to the funeral home, they look like nothing happened to them, and then we put them in a steel casket, which is guaranteed not to rot. We encase them in concrete, and there goes Uncle Bob. We're not in the presence of death, which is not pleasant.
And we do the same thing with our own food. Chicken comes in a plastic wrapper. You know, our beef comes pre-cut. You know, even our vegetables, all this food comes to us cold out of a supermarket. And, you know, you talk to people, even if they're not vegans or vegetarians or animal rights activists, like, ooh, I could never kill a chicken, or I could never, but you eat hamburger every day. Like death, you are consuming death. But what we've done is, just like human death, we've removed the idea of animal death.
Absolutely.
And so we do not fully, I think this is one reason why people have a problem with hunting, is they have been so removed their entire life, they have never seen the butchering of an animal. Ever. The only thing they ever see is a YouTube video of someone hunting a deer.
And most of those, by the way, are being deleted.
Right. So
in all seriousness.
I know. So we can't have the whole idea of bloodshed, animal bloodshed, death. Humans are aware of it. We're scared of it. We want to remove ourselves from it. When we do that, we remove ourselves from nature. We become unnatural. I think we become jaded and confused. I think one of the great benefits of hunting is actually being part of that circle of life, and in the most humane way you can, taking an animal where he or she lives, in her favorite place on earth, quickly, fastly, and knowing that that's a healthy animal, and that you processed it and brought it to table for yourself, for your family. That's awesome. And people I know who just got into hunting and they experience that, it's a very emotional thing.
It is. There's a fascinating movement, and I don't know where it's going. I think it's falling away. But there was, in my experience, in the 90s and the early 2000s, a movement toward bow hunting.
Yes. And
many men and women were doing it because they were looking for a greater challenge than using firearms. And there was an intimacy with it. Now, the reason I say is I think we're going away from it is we're moving in the industry to crossbows, which have a far greater distance.
Yes.
And the experiences I've had with a bow, the longest shot I've ever made was 7 yards. So I was that close to the animal. Now, the animal didn't die in my presence on every occasion. It went off. But there was an intimacy in that moment. But I've also had to go and put an animal down with my hands, with a knife. And I will tell you again, I'm not everyone else, but there is something magnificent in that moment and unbelievably sad, thus the argument for tragedy, that I will tell you, as I do, and I'm proud of it, I'll tell you, but at the same time, I do it intentionally as a result of those moments. I process my own meat. We built a home, which is very simple, but with a huge island, just so I could put 2 animals on it. I can process it. My wife can be grinding at the end and packaging, and that we take responsibility for. I don't waste the meat that I killed. The animals, particularly that I killed so closely, whose lives I took, and I saw their death. I literally felt their death occasions.
Yes.
There's a value that comes with it in that moment also of the immediacy of my own end.
Yes.
This is how I will end.
Yeah.
And I don't think that that's not, I'm using a double negative, I don't think that that's not part of God's framework for creation. Now, you can say that that's a result of sin. I don't know, because Cain and Abel didn't seem to be so deformed. There seems to be no radical transformation for the way that animals eat and consume foods, etc., in that Genesis story. I don't see a deformation of nature so much so that it is something that it was not. And if that predatory nature is something that is vicious, yet at the same time can be beautiful, it recognizes the fact that we don't want to be that, and that can call us then to look for a savior, a God, but also recognize the magnificence of this structure, the integrated nature of it.
Yeah.
Any part of the biotic, a term used in the 20th century, particularly by a conservationist biologist by the name of Aldo Leopold, anything in the biotic community that goes awry, that is abused, misused, will affect us.
Mm-hmm.
You frack,
yeah,
you do, it has an effect.
That's right.
Now, I drive a truck, and I feel guilty about it.
Yeah, right.
But I should in some ways. And I know some people right now are recoiling. But the point is, what happens to the world affects you, and it should. We don't, as you were saying, have that awareness. We watch YouTube videos or cable shows, but notice that even in the animal shows, hardly ever is there an animal that's caught and eaten. And I'll tell you, I don't like watching those.
Yeah.
Because there's something intimate about that I don't think should be filmed.
Yeah.
I don't know, but I'm rambling.
Mm-hmm. Isn't it interesting that when we look into the Old Testament scriptures, the Hebrew scriptures, we see that this idea of eating meat and consuming meat is regulated strictly by Levitical law and has a cultic element. And even if you go outside Judaism and you look at the ancient pagan Greeks, like you look at the ceremonies in Homer's Iliad and Odyssey and the way they sacrifice, this idea, like if you go like Iliad and Odyssey, when they're going to have a sacrifice, it is a barbecue party. It's a grill out.
Absolutely.
It is a celebration. And so, but there's also this idea that the meat is so good, and there's a tragedy, there's a joy and a tragedy. There's a Good Friday and an Easter, that it's so tragic, but yet so good and so wonderful and nutritious and tasting good that somehow it needs to be offered to the divine.
Yeah. Well, in the Odyssey, Odysseus goes and kills a stag for his men. So there's also the sense of there's a communal aspect, or should be a communal aspect, a sharing that goes on.
Yeah.
If you think about it, if you don't have a freezer and you kill a stag, there's only so much you can eat.
Yeah.
We see this with studies of Paleo-Indian groups, for instance. There's a natural sharing that goes on with the killing of an animal, or should.
Yeah.
What we generally buy are these little pieces in the store.
Right.
But if you kill an animal and you don't have a freezer or refrigerator, which is the truth up until, I guess, 80 years ago, then that animal needs to be consumed immediately, and or you salt it, dry it in portions, etc. But you're not going to do all that labor yourself. You're probably going to have help even doing that labor, and you're going to share that. There's a sharing that comes with it that, again, brings this communal aspect and a value to the life of the animal. Now, by the way, in the Aeneid, of course, Virgil has Aeneas not kill one, but I think he kills 7 stags, carries them all on his shoulders, and brings them down to his guys. So, but again, he shares that which he has.
Yes.
And we look, I mean, think about Christianity. Where's the place that we identify as the cultural center, the us, not, if you will, others? We tie ourselves together. It's in a blood sacrifice.
Yeah.
For some, it's just grape juice. For others, for it's wine. Right. But it's more than that, right? If you want to go train substantiation.
The night before he dies, he takes bread and wine. This is my body. There's this eating. And what's interesting about this is, it's flesh and blood, but it's presented as bread and wine. So it's plant veggie based, but its essence, its substance is human blood sacrifice.
But they had just partaken of the Paschal lamb.
Right. Well, some church fathers debate whether there was a lamb or not. Jesus himself being there, being the lamb. Some say there was a lamb. So I don't know. We don't know. It doesn't say.
All I'm saying is he's a Jew.
Yeah.
I'm saying there's probably a lamb present.
Yeah.
Somebody was eating a lamb.
Right.
It makes sense to me that you just had blood. It would have had to be cooked. You have to follow Levitical law. Right. But you just had meat.
Yeah.
You just had it. You just recognized, if you were paying attention, something died. Yeah. And then he gives this.
Right. Yeah, because it says after they supped.
Promise.
Yeah, after they ate.
Yeah.
So.
He gives this promise of blood and not just blood, but of a new possibility. Forgiveness for your sins.
Yeah. Now, in the title of your book is the word Nimrod.
Yes.
So we end Genesis 1 through 11. We just camped out there a lot because there's a lot there. No, it's perfect. We talked all about meat and eating meat and killing and humans' relation to death. As soon as Genesis 1:11 is over, we meet Nimrod ever so briefly. Tell us
Yeah,
who
so
Nimrod is and give
the
us the
character,
quote.
yeah, the character of Nimrod shows up Genesis 10, and it's very beginning. He's tucked in there, and there's this fascinating line. It's variously transcribed that basically says there was this Nimrod, and he was a mighty hunter before the Lord. I think is how the King James does it.
Mm-hmm.
He was a hero of the chase, and he was that by either in the sight of Yahweh or by Yahweh's grace, depending upon your interpretation.
Wow.
So much so that he
Wow.
was known as a hero, like Nimrod, if you will. This is what a mighty hunter is. So, in other words, this character Nimrod was declared to be such a great hunter that I would just simply say, I'm trying to think of a good analogy that's not politically motivated. Man, you're like a regular Davy Crockett
Yeah.
or Daniel Boone. And that means that you're a great hunter, or maybe you're a great adventurer. So it becomes legendary, so much so that the name becomes the catchphrase for
he's
a great
like
hunter.
he's like GOAT, greatest of all time.
Exactly.
It's like you're the Michael Jordan. He's the
Exactly.
He's the hunter.
It. He's the hunter. But he was a hunter in, depending on how you interpret it, in the sight of Yahweh, or by the power and the grace of Yahweh.
Yeah.
It's a complicated
he's in
line.
the presence of God.
In the presence of God. So God sees it and he's recognized. And some even put agency with the divine, empowering to be this. Now, Nimrod's interesting because then it says that he begins to build cities, and it gives him credit for all the major cities there, including one's kind of questionable, but where it is, but in that Mesopotamian region. So he's the great city builder. Now, if you're a hunter, in most cases, you're not near a city. You're in a liminal space on an edge. So you have a character who's a great hunter who has to go out. In Gilgamesh's story, the guy who encounters Enkidu, who's been created out of dust to challenge Gilgamesh, but been made out of dust by the gods, and who's running with the animals and gazelles, the person who encounters him is the hunter, the trapper, because he's setting all the animals free from his traps. So they have to set a trap for Enkidu. Enkidu is trapped by a woman in sexuality. He's civilized, taught to drink beer, eat bread, and wear clothes, and he goes to town. And Enkidu's transformed, and he's no longer, the gazelles run from him. Well, the same thing is true. If you, it's just it's seemingly two opposites that exist: a great hunter and a great city builder, all in this one person. Well, the fascinating thing about Nimrod is there's not that much, but there's just this hint of who was this guy. So throughout the Jewish tradition, the Hebrew tradition, you have expositions on who this Nimrod was. The Christian fathers pick that up and run with it, as do then at the end of the Middle Ages, the early modern theologians, both from the Roman Catholic Church and then the emerging Protestant churches, all turn to Nimrod, and as I argue in the book, use him as a malleable figure, so that he is either the enemy of God, the hunter of men, as Augustine believes him to be.
So Augustine says the hunting is the hunting of men.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He's the empire builder.
He's the dictator. Yeah.
Exactly. During the early modern period, as we move into the period of approaching the Enlightenment, he's seen as a tyrant. So someone who despises the rights of men. And so we see him utilized by people to be whatever they want him to be. So much so, I was watching a television show the other day, and someone called someone a Nimrod. And today, in 20th and 21st century parlance, it's a bad word. Huh.
They said Nimrod.
It was, who said Nimrod?
You're saying they said you're a Nimrod.
Yeah, you're a Nimrod.
I've never heard that before.
Really? Oh, yes.
I've heard nincompoop, but I never heard Nimrod.
You see it make a transformation. It's already there. But even in English literature, by the 1800s, which is fascinating because it had become a bad word. It meant either a tyrant, a despot, an agent of the devil who enslaves us as a tyrant.
Right.
So throw off that Nimrod. So it's spiritualized. Or it's literally a tyrant of the past who then becomes a type for one of the future. But you begin to see it as an example of who you want to be, a Nimrod, a great hunter. So when we begin to see the rise of sport hunting culture in England in particular, in Britain, in the late 1700s, early 1800s, we see people picking up the term of Nimrod and saying, I'm a Nimrod. I'm a mighty hunter.
Right.
So it takes on this positive approach. Even you have people using it as a synonym, not a synonym. What's the word I'm looking for? The name they're writing under, their pen name.
Yeah,
fancy
pseudonym.
word.
Yeah, okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Their pen name using the name Nimrod in sporting journals, which began to show up in the 19th century. But at the same time, Nimrod was used many times in the negative sense as someone who becomes a tyrant of the earth.
Right.
Again, that the sport hunter rapes and pillages the earth, taking animals. So Nimrod transforms its way through history to become, for brief time periods, examples of what it means to be a great hunter, but almost always the hunter then is utilized to express a negative behavior, something to be avoided. So this Nimrod character is really interesting. So I put him in the title of the book because he demands interpretation, because Nimrod's character, as he's been described, is not just a hunter, someone who has a relationship to nature, but someone who has a relationship to other humans. So what is our understanding of God? How do we understand creation, our plan that he's tried to express to us through revelation, through the teachings of the church, etc.? How then do we understand our relationship to each other? How do we understand right relationship even in community, urban versus, if you will, kind of suburban or disappearing rural? And how do we see then the world, the natural world around us, animal as well as, if you will, just earth and conservation?
I've kind of been wondering about this, that Noah seems to, although he slays animals in sacrifice, he seems to be a rescuer of animals. Is there an intention that Nimrod is not a rescuer of animals? Maybe not. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, there's so little about Nimrod that's there.
Right.
We just don't know. I mean, and there's been a number of scripture scholars and ancient historians who've tried to say that Nimrod actually was a historical character, but no one can pin it down. There's just this vagueness, yet his exemplary behavior in the sight of Yahweh. If it had just said, and he was a mighty hunter, no one would make a big deal about it.
Yeah.
But in the sight of Yahweh, or by the power of Yahweh, some see then in the sight of Yahweh as he was defiant of Yahweh. He hunted in defiance of it. The Hebrew scriptures are so vague that it opens itself up then. Sure. And so what you think of Nimrod in some ways is a mirror to your own perspectives.
Right. Interesting. Huh. So if we move on from Nimrod, because there's not much more to say, right? I mean, it's just
well, there's an entire chapter. Feel free to read it.
I mean, but it can lend itself either way.
It does. That's my argument. Is that it's look at this is what we've done with him.
Yeah. Now, one of the things that came up on the Steve Rinella podcast that you did on Meat Eater was the idea of hunting in the Levitical laws and whether it's even possible. Was it possible for someone in the Old Testament who wanted to follow the letter of the law to actually sport hunt under God's Levitical customs and law?
Right. Because
there's all these restrictions on how an animal is to be killed. Now, modern Judaism adds a whole bunch to it. I'm not talking about that. I'm not talking about the rabbis and all that. I'm talking about the actual text in the Pentateuch. Is it possible?
So again, I'm mostly historian. So I turned in this kind of exploration to a friend of mine, a professor. His name's Kenneth Bass, and he's a scripture scholar, to explore this topic. And so there's a chapter in the book where he does just that. What his conclusions were quite fascinating. So he explored in particular in the Hebrew Bible what was the role of the hunter. What he discovered was, and he approaches it with a kind of audience reception theory, and that is, how would the audience have received this when they encountered it? That is, this section in the Hebrew Bible. Not in some ways trying to argue what authorial intent was, because that's almost impossible.
Sure.
But you assume, as an author, that your reader will get what you're talking about. So
Right. Otherwise, you wouldn't do it. Yeah.
exactly, as you wouldn't do it. So that's as much as you're going to assume on authorial intent, but looking at what the audience's reception would be. So a kind of reader's approach to it. What he concluded was is that hunters, despite the rare reference of Esau, Nimrod, now other people kill animals. David kills animals. You
Samson.
get Samson who killed, but they're not hunting per se. It's more of a defense, or they're defending something like, for instance, herds. I wouldn't put it as predator hunting. The predator comes to the herds, and they're defending the domesticated animals.
Right.
So those who go out after the animals. What he finds in the Hebrew Bible is there's hunters all over the place. Now, in most cases, they're depicted in a negative fashion, but that's too easy a way of saying it. What he finds is that hunters are depicted, or hunting is depicted throughout the Hebrew Bible, but that the writers particularly play at the tragedy of the hunting, the pathos of the hunting. So on occasion, hunters fall into their own traps. But most of the time, what you see is that you want to, the writer's trying to get you to identify with the animal that is trapped, that is caught in his own web, or is caught then by the devil, or by an enemy, or by sin, or by temptation. And so there's hunting going on, but that it's not as though hunting is negative per se. It is that the writer wants you to attach yourself to that particular part of the hunting experience. Now, that's interesting.
Yeah.
If I want to describe to you something and I want you to understand it, that means you've got to have a knowledge of it.
Correct.
If you have no knowledge of hunting because it's taboo, how are you going to know that most intimate of experiences? So first off, he argues if they're using this, I don't want to say trope, but they're using this tool, this literary tool repeatedly over perhaps hundreds of years, the Hebrew people were very much aware of hunting. When Jesus says, you see that sparrow? There's not a sparrow that falls that my Father is not aware of it. That sparrow falls because it was the cheapest form of meat food available in the market. Right. Sparrows were shot and or trapped, netted, and sold in the market. Notice, by the way, the sparrow dies, is trapped, hunted. God doesn't stop it. And Jesus acknowledges it.
Yeah.
So,
and he's making that point so that the human makes his own reflection that, oh, just as these animals get hunted and that's tragic and I have an emotional response to that, right, so also God knows my own emotional responses.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So there's an example. But throughout the Hebrew Bible, there's far more complex rather than sparrows.
Yeah, and in the Psalms,
hunted. Exactly.
Yeah.
So first off, that was his analysis, and that's very insightful. And he goes through and catalogs them. He begins to break them down into patterns. But the other thing he noted then is that there are a lot of animals that are listed as being acceptable foodstuffs that could only be acquired, like ibexes and gazelles, that could only be acquired by way of hunting. Right. So Levitical law has at least an open door to the catching of animals and to hunting. The Hebrew scriptures assumes that the readers and the Hebrew people know about hunting, particularly this most kind of, I don't want to say, again, I use the word tragic, but emotional aspect of it, can apply that to themselves, use their imagination and their emotions to understand something about themselves, what they should or shouldn't do, who their God is. And then the other thing he noticed is that the person who hunts the most in the Hebrew Bible is not Esau, it's not Nimrod, it's Yahweh.
Yeah.
Yahweh is the hunter. Yahweh is the warrior, and Yahweh is the hunter. Yahweh hunts Israel. And so the metaphor and the analogies that are used of hunting are applied directly to the divine being.
Yes.
So if hunting is wrong,
right, yeah, it's a
why
problem.
is Yahweh doing it?
Yeah.
Who is supposedly our model and our Savior and our God.
Right.
So it's a fascinating study. And so I've never seen anyone come across that. And I think it's actually relatively groundbreaking.
Yeah. It's because I think the tendency for all of us is, okay, we have an issue or a pet issue. I'm going to go to the concordance, or I'm going to go to the Bible search, and I'm going to find out how many times the word occurs. And then I'm going to chronicle those, and I'm going to write my essay, my blog post, my journal article, my book, or whatever. And what's interesting is, well, we're not looking for characters. we're seeing God
Yeah.
applying the hunter motif to himself, and that to me is the greatest argument.
Right. And you've got to look for things you wouldn't think of, by the way, like pits and nets
Yes.
and
Snares.
walls and snares.
Yes.
This is all part of hunting.
Yeah.
And
Arrows.
it's Yahweh who does this.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's the arrow and the spear. These are the ones, maybe a jawbone, but these are the things then we think of, these are the weapons we identify as being aggressive hunting weapons, but not always.
Yeah. Now,
on the contrary.
Other than the Lord himself, probably the most obvious hunting story would be Jacob and Esau.
Yes.
And, the story, well, I'll let you tell the story, but Jacob, Esau, and the hunt, right, and the deception.
Right. So, of course, you've got Jacob and Esau, these two twins. They're relatively competitive, and they belong to two different spheres. Esau is a hunter. He's ruddy, whatever that means.
Yeah.
Whether that's his hair or his skin from being out of doors. Right. He's just a hairy beast of a guy, apparently. Yep. And here's the thing. His father, Isaac, got to make sure I got my names right.
Yep.
Loves wild game.
Yeah, hunted meat.
He loves wild game.
Not the domesticated out in the pen. He likes the stuff out in the woods.
I want my venison on the hoof out there.
Yes.
So as the aged man then has kind of one of his last requests of sorts. It's not last word, but he's aged. He's blind. He asks his son Esau, who's his favorite, by the way, to go get him some meat. Son, go hunt something down. Bring daddy some good venison. Mm-hmm. Now, Esau goes, but he has another son, Jacob, the deceiver of sorts, who hangs out not in the fields, but in the tents, many times in the company of women.
Yes.
And his mother is trying to manipulate then the affection of Isaac for Jacob. And Jacob and his mother work out a plan where venison is acquired. And Jacob puts on, I don't know how this works, basically some fur, which is deceptive, goes into the blind father, offers it to him. His father feels his hairiness, blesses him instead of blessing the older son Esau. Esau comes back and says, what happened? I was gone for a little bit, brought back food, and this is what the deceiver, my brother, has done. And mom, by the way.
Yeah, mom was in on it.
And so the story then has these two brothers, the tent dweller.
Yeah, I call him the mama's boy. Jacob's the mama's boy.
And the mama's boy, kind of an effeminate character, and the ruddy, red, hairy man of the field and hunter in juxtaposition. Interestingly enough, while God does bless Esau, it's the tent dweller, the raiser of animals. There's a story, of course, about how he's blessed with his herds. It's the nomadic, sometimes suburban or urban type domesticator of animals is the one that God chooses.
The pastoralist.
Not the pastoralist. Good, excellent term. It's not the hunter.
Yeah. And this is kind of used as an argument. This is the definitive moment where God says, hunting is evil, pastoralism is good.
Pastoralism is good, yeah.
And should we read that story as a condemnation of hunting? Or is there an ideology here? Or is it just that it so happens that Esau is the hunter, Jacob's the pastoralist? And then also, I think as men, we ask ourselves, well, is it also saying that being a mama's boy and like manipulating your dad with your mom is also like the righteous? Like, is that what we want to teach our sons? Like, hey, hang out with mom a lot and trick me to get stuff that you want. I don't know about that either.
It's tricky. I mean, and he's also, if I remember correctly, a polygamist, which never really works out well in the Hebrew Bible.
No.
It's hard to make Jacob a hero. He's an anti-hero in some ways. Yeah. Yet he's a hero. He's the hero of the faith, the founder. Yeah, I know you've got Abraham, but he's the founder of the children of Israel. So it's hard not to take the story at times as a condemnation of hunting. But then if it's a condemnation of hunting and of a past way of life, is this simply a myth that explains a transition then from the hunting and gathering way of life to the more sedentary, so instead of right? The mobile the hunting and gathering lifestyle, which makes and fends for itself, to this sedentary pastoralist, to agriculturalist. Perhaps it is. Maybe it does answer that question in that way. This is of course the people who are writing the story. It's difficult. Again, how many people name their kids Esau?
Yeah, nobody.
Yeah, I know a lot of Jacobs.
A lot of Jacobs, no Esau's.
Yeah.
And I've been reflecting on this, and I'm thinking to myself, it does seem to be the way of nature, the way of God's providential care, that we move into an agricultural and pastoral society, because, the way of the hunter, or the pot hunter, the one who's going for food, is difficult. I mean, and you think about how it's very difficult to sustain. You can look at like the Native Americans and the Sioux and these tribes, that when the buffalo disappear,
Yes.
it's apocalyptic,
Right.
because that's what they have. And so also like, depending on how many animals can you kill to feed 100,000 people?
Right.
How much hunting do you have to do to feed 100,000 people? It's not sustainable. So for us to have a culture and a society, and all of our kids get 3 meals a day and get, enough protein and fat and the things that we need for everyone to survive, you have to transition from the wild game to the pastoralist, cultivated, domesticated food sources for the prosperity of all. And yet,
we have the meal.
And yet there is the fringe of us, like you and me, who still have that itch in them to go out and get the food that Isaac wants.
Right.
And is that bad?
It's intriguing. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, so there's a couple of questions of historically we know that we see population explosions take place. Mm-hmm. The Neolithic agricultural revolution is not only accompanied by the rise of towns and villages, but huge population.
Yes.
And then when you see that type of transitions or new innovations in agriculture, we see then huge population booms. So we support them by way of by way of agriculture. If we lived in a hunting and gathering society, population would be very small.
No.
So it's when we shift and we move then that we have those things. So there is the question of what must we do to continue the population? And it radically changes the culture and the expectations of relationships as people populate the earth and live in increasingly urban environments. And you can see that literally changing mores in America over the last 200 years. Yes. As we move from a mostly rural to now a dramatically more urban environment. And populations are there. They make the votes, they make the choices for decision making when it comes to policy, when it comes to laws, etc.
Yeah.
So we're experiencing that ourselves. And so the question then is, there's multiple questions. For the Christian, is hunting a wrong action? Is it something that makes me worse? In other words, first off, is there, did God say no to it? Or is it something that is not part of the perfection of my person as deemed by God, that God has provided plans then and works through us through grace, but for the perfection of our person, which probably will never be in this time period, right, in this life, but that we are working forward and hopefully being transformed by grace, is there a place for hunting to disappear? Or just we shouldn't participate at all?
Right.
Is it a misuse of God's creation?
Yeah.
And if it's a misuse of God's creation, opens all kinds of other doors. Then also, should you be killing animals at all? So should you be killing animals in an impersonal way, where you basically have your own assassins that then provide for you meat for your stomach? You don't even there for the death.
Yeah. You don't even want to know about it. You just want the styrofoam container, the meat, the wrap over it, right? With the sticker with the name on it, price per pound. That's all you want. And then some people don't even do that. Yeah. They just eat out. It literally comes as a pre-prepared hamburger or a chicken nugget in a box.
The only blood they want to see is in their rare steak.
Yes, right.
And they really don't want to think what the red is, if that makes sense. They joke about mooing, but they would never think about being there for that moment.
When the moo turns to a well, I won't even say, but you know what it sounds like.
Oh, yeah. I butchered my first cow in the last year. Mm-hmm. put it down, and the farmer put it down, and it was my responsibility to butcher the whole sucker
Yeah. How
for
long did it take
family.
you? How long did it take you?
I did it at night. I think it took me around 3 to 4 hours.
By yourself?
Yeah, well, the guys are standing around watching me with the headlights on, and and the guy for whom I was cutting it up, who has a number of children, I was cutting up. He would help me and sharpen blades and hand them to me.
Yep.
It took me a good, I'm going to say 4 hours in the Texas field.
Yep.
It was hot and it was vicious.
I've never actually done a cow, but I've done big animals, and it takes. I've done it with other guys, like 2 hours. You know?
Oh yeah, I did my first elk this year. I couldn't move it. I needed everybody to help me.
Yeah.
To move it and to do it. All that is to say is that once you start thinking about it, the questions just pour.
Yeah.
One of my goals then, in the whole process, I mean, I joke about Dr. Bebbington and the French thing, is to encourage Christians just to think. I'm not sure what the answer is going to be for each one of them. But if they take seriously this idea of, should I or should I not? What's my role? Who am I in relationship to God? Who am I in relationship to nature? What does Scripture inform me? What does my tradition inform me? If they're doing that, the constant, I want to say like a Hegelian process of throwing ideas out and encountering, different ideas back, and there will be a transformation and a responsibility for who they are as a person, as a child of God in God's world. It's not ours, it's God's.
Yeah.
And if they come to the conclusion that hunting is wrong for them, I wholly support that. If they can articulate the reasons why. And I would support them in some ways. I'll say this is kind of, this will throw, if you will, gas on the fire. I'll support them more than I will support the hunter who never thinks, who just shoots willy-nilly, who kills animals and leaves them because someone said it was okay, who has not worked through that process of responsibility.
Yeah.
If you have a child, do you not think about what it means to be a parent, bring a soul into the world?
Right.
Have you thought about taking a life out of the world?
Yeah.
Whether it's a cow on your plate or the animal that you actually just brought about their death.
Yeah.
We're responsible.
Yeah. I've had that struggle my entire life. My dad hunted. My relatives hunt. I hunted as a boy. I've been to Africa to hunt. All over North America, small game, big game. And there's always been, like you said, there's that tragedy in it. But also something metaphysical about it.
Absolutely.
Something transformative. I remember being with my oldest son and getting his first deer, and both of us kind of being a little teary, like kind of a weird, like emotional, like primal thing happens, like,
Absolutely.
And just seeing him and like, are you okay? Do you want to pray? Like it's a big deal, and I think I talked with my brother about this, and we still, after all these years, you get that, I don't know what the feeling is, but when the hunt goes well and you're there with that animal and it's just died, and there's this feeling that I can't explain, but even when I retell hunting stories, it comes back to me, and I think it just must be like this ancient primal feeling of taking a life, and then you've killed, and now I'm going to live. Mm-hmm. This animal has been sacrificed for me. Yeah, and then one day I'm going to be food for worms and bacteria. So it's just this, very few of us, unless you're in a war, have a direct encounter with dead human bodies. Right. Pretty rare, unless you're a policeman or something. But to be in the presence of the dead human body, and then to prepare it and then to eat it is there's something, I don't want to say supernatural because it's too strong, but there's something preternatural to it. And I think as a Christian, I could agree with someone who says I can't hunt. I find it repulsive, or I find it unethical. But I think when it comes to like extreme animal rights activism, like PETA or something like that, as Christians, we have Acts 10, where there's a vision where Peter sees all these animals, clean and unclean, kosher and unkosher. Right. God says to kill them and eat them.
Right.
There's a command. We can debate on Genesis 6 and pre-flood and all that, but it's very clear, a commandment in Acts 10 take, kill, eat,
Right.
slaughter, eat.
And
Unclean
you have to
and clean.
remember where Peter is. He's in a tanner's home.
Right, good point. Yeah.
So there's two different things. One, first off, that's an outcast, someone who's physically removed from town
Yes.
because the fluids associated with tanning and the chemicals and all that supposedly made them just reek, like it got into their skin.
Mm-hmm.
So the tanner was ostracized or at least marginalized dramatically. It was even some claims apparently that Hebrew tanners even had their own synagogue, their own congregation, because they just stunk so bad. So Peter's at a tanner's home. He's in the presence of death. Now remember, those animals are being transformed into writing instruments, to vellum, to parchment.
Yeah,
in which, by the way, the word of God would be written.
Yeah, the Pentateuch would be written on, leather.
Yeah, on vellum, right? So on an animal skin. The same thing that covers us in the Genesis account and covers our sins is the thing on which then the promise is written.
Yes.
Wow, I think there's something there.
Even the phylacteries that held their Bible verses are leather.
Absolutely.
So shoes, everything.
That's what's going on perhaps downstairs. That's the odor that Peter is in the presence of. And right, the sheet descends, and there's all the animals, and he's told kill and eat. Now, does he? He doesn't. But then he gets the point, right? Of course, Cornelius' servant shows up, and he realizes this God-fearing Gentile essentially is welcome, as well as we have then apparently what seems to be a negation of the dietary laws and restrictions. Even in Mark chapter 7, there's a reference where Jesus makes a statement, and Mark edits it and goes, and this is where he said basically everything can be on the menu, right? That there's no unclean foods. Yeah. It's kind of after the fact, but it's a realization that the early church came to, and you have this vision of Peter that seems to endorse then the ending of the Levitical laws. Acts chapter 15, they're like, then what's on the menu, what's not? Circumcision, no circumcision. They come to the conclusion, don't even have to do circumcision.
That's right.
Don't eat animals in their blood, right? So there's certain things, and don't mess around sexually.
Yeah.
So they're taking the covenant and opening it and opening and opening it. Apparently animals that would be hunted not only would have been acceptable, apparently, if you pay close attention, but many of those animals, they're all.
And isn't it interesting how, we're kind of coming full circle here. We talked about in Genesis 1 and 2 about how animals are related to man, humankind. God names them, so there's a special relationship there. Cain and Abel, Noah saving not all the vegetables, but the animals. And then here in Acts 10, the signal that all humans can be cleansed by the blood of Jesus, all humans can be saved, is another analogy, all animals are clean.
Right.
So it's kind of like there's kosher animals and wild animals, there's kosher Jews and wild Gentiles, and now we're saying that the animal kingdom and all of its variety is included for your diet, which means all human races are included in redemption. Without
it's restriction. That inclusive nature.
Yeah, so this idea, the animals and their cleanliness actually brings about the universalness of Christianity. It's Catholicism,
again,
if you will.
Yeah, it takes Peter's imagination to have to interpret this. So again, we're talking about the power of the human mind that God is willing to embrace.
He interprets it as all can be baptized, including Cornelius and the Romans.
And his household, right?
Yeah, so he takes a vision about animals and food, and he he recognizes the doctrine, baptism, faith is for all.
I mean, again, whatever your perspective is, there's so much about the connection between animals and humans.
Yeah.
In our salvation, our personality, who we should be as children of God and as followers of Christ. Again, in Revelation, which is the yay, we win story,
yes.
Jesus is, yes, triumphant, but he's also the sacrificed bloody lamb.
Yeah.
So there's a lot going on. Animal death and humans, animal life and human death, how these all play together, we've lost it, I think. Yeah. It's a nasty and violent world in which the gospel came into being. and that good news from the beginning, that there was going to be a redemption, that there was hope, and that God was faithful, has always been a story of humanity intertwined with nature, with animals, with the world, with the soil. And that integrated view of the world is something, I think it's just, I don't know how you do it, how you bring Christians into contact with that. When I talk to my students, I ask them many times, how many of you have ever planted anything in a garden? I've been teaching now for 10 years at this current university. And I can tell you now that I have moved from generally about 5 out of 30 to now generally I have 1 to 2 out of 30 who have ever planted anything. How do you understand the gospel?
Yeah.
How do you understand the message of the unity of God's great creation? How do you understand, of course, the taking of life, etc., when we become so insulated? It's I don't know.
Yes.
I don't know, but it's a call.
Yeah. To close, what would you say to I think it was you, or maybe it was Steve Rinella, that said that most hunters in the United States tend to be conservative and tend to identify as Christian.
Yes.
Did you say that? I can't remember.
I did. It's in one of the chapters.
Yes.
I went and did a lot of used sociological instruments, so interview stuff that they did, and used the data, and it wasn't used to determine about hunting, but began to use and show a movement over about 20 years in America in particular. And what we see, of course, is a dramatic decline in hunters in America.
Yes.
The number has just dropped off. And for hunting, of course, there's this question of how do we perpetuate hunting and who do we bring in? And that's a struggle in and of itself. So we see that number drop. But what's fascinating that I discovered is that the number of hunters who remain are more religious as a group than they were decades ago. So hunters in America are increasingly religious. Now, that doesn't mean that they go to church every Sunday or Saturday night. What it does mean is that they profess a belief in the divine and they identify as being religious. Now, the majority of them are from from Christian denominations. And there are a few on the outside that just kind of swing in different ways. But nonetheless, we're increasingly religious as the remnant.
Right, and by religious we mean Christian, predominantly.
Predominantly Christian. Yeah. So if they identify as Christian, and that's who most hunters are nowadays, they identify with the Christian tradition. I think the message of, so who are you then as a Christian hunter, is more applicable in some ways than it's ever been, except maybe the medieval period. Right. So the question's there. Why are you doing it?
Yes.
You explain yourself.
Is it okay?
Yeah. And how then, if you think it is okay, how then should you do it? What would Jesus do?
Right.
Kind of. The point, how should I do this? And I think that persistent question then can create a conversation about the ethics of hunting, but particularly in the context of faith. I've
noticed a trend online, social media, because, for several years, even till recently, all these, trophy hunters in Africa, they get posted on social media. Millions of people would downvote, block it, take down the videos, And so we've seen maybe in the last 2 years with Steve Rinella, Cameron Hanes, even Joe Rogan, who's, really popular, he's hunting now, that in order to defend hunting, it's gone to, this is meat acquisition.
Yes.
Do you think that is the right approach for a Christian? Is to, because I myself have focused more on that now. I'm like, okay, well, how much meat would it yield? I could look at a price of a hunt or the effort of a hunt. How much meat does it yield? Is the meat good?
Right.
So is that a factor? Should we Christians, when we talk about hunting, say, well, hey, we're getting antibiotic-free, hormone-free meat, grass-fed meat. It's economic. It feeds our children. Is that the apologetics that we engage in? And then what do we say about trophies? Like, if if you go into my library, I have all kinds of majestic mounts of animals that I've killed, and um, I think that's great. I mean, it reminds me of these epic adventures and the food that I ate and the hunt that I had. And, people come in there and I tell them stories all about it. And I think it's fine. I have zero moral conscience problem with it at all. So I think those are like the two things that hunters today are struggling with, especially on social media. And I'm kind of curious whether Christians should follow that mainstream apologetic.
Mm-hmm. All right, it's a great question. Great questions. Let me give you a couple of answers. I mean, first off, you can look. I don't know if you can actually see behind me or not, but I mean, there's like skulls.
Yeah.
There's antlers.
Yeah.
There's teeth.
What are those skulls right there? What are those skulls over
What's
your
that?
left ear? Over your left ear, what are those skulls?
These are coyotes, and then I think some raccoons and bobcats.
Okay.
There's, I think, a part of a pig up there. There's turkey feathers, and there's a bobcat up there and some various antlers. These just in my study. And there's, I think, a coyote in the corner. So that's a great question. So one of the things we see, though, is increasingly as hunters drop in number, the people who are left behind are those who are wealthy, who can afford to go out of the city to go to places where there's game that is being managed, whether behind high fences, which are becoming quite a thing, or just in regions where there's fowl or there's fur available. So one of the arguments that I have made is that what we're seeing is a return to the Middle Ages, and that is where only the wealthy, maybe not the landed nobility, but the equivalent of the capitalistic nobility, have the opportunity to do this. Yes. They're not maybe doing it as a way of introducing their young men to martial skills, but something else is going on. So that's one trend. And that's capitalism and Christianity at play.
Yeah, because in the medieval era, all the deer belonged to the king. And if you killed one, I think at some points there was capital punishment.
Absolutely.
For taking the king, for hunting the king's deer.
Poaching was, you die for it.
Yeah.
So that's one thing to play with when you think about trophy hunting or just hunting in general. Texas is a perfect example of that. I've hunted in many states. I've hunted up north. I was a student at Notre Dame, and so I stayed on as a school teacher in South Bend, Indiana. And I hunted on farmers' places who just wanted me to kill deer to keep down the predation on corn and soybeans. And many times, if I also trapped on the side, trapped raccoons, etc., it made them happy. And it facilitated my entrance onto these properties. That said, increasingly, Texas is becoming the guide for the rest of the nation, and that is we see leases popping up where leases never were before. So there's limited hunting territory. Many times it's mixed with cattle ranching, or sometimes with agricultural regions, and you pay increasingly a premium for access to this land. And of course, if there actually happens to be game that is trophy, categorized as trophy, you're going to pay more. Or you can go behind a high fence where essentially animals are raised, to be honest, like domesticated animals, and the states are fighting this. Missouri Supreme Court just had a ruling on this one. Texas is still fighting with this, and our Texas Parks and Wildlife Department is fighting with these high fence on it, because the issue is if it's not a game animal, it's right. You can't call it a game animal. You can't regulate it within my fences. Then it's a domesticated animal, and the USDA should have control of it.
Interesting.
So it's a huge issue. Where does Christianity play into this as we talk about trophy hunting and access to hunting? And there's a whole movement, a foodie movement as well, that is taking seriously the consumption of life, and therefore is taking seriously the idea of hunting, as many of them take then responsibility for the food on the plate. And the Christians are stuck in the middle here.
Yeah. Where do we fit?
There's a quote, I think, from a Catholic priest, by the way. Let's see. Here we go. This is from Father Ted Vitale. He's the chair of the Department of Philosophy at St. Louis University. And Ted is a veteran. He's been in this debate about the ethics of hunting, but particularly from a Christian perspective now for decades. And I'm not going to say he's at the end of his career, but I think he's approaching, as we were discussing him being a part of the project since 2007, actually. He was one of the first ones to come on. His idea about what can I do and what can't I do and where's the argument going. And he's increasingly kind of come to his own conclusions and realizing that some of the dialogue is just not going to work. But his conclusion is, he says, therefore, fair chase must mean at least that hunting should be conducive to the well-being of the biotic community and should be conducted by human participants according to the best rules and laws generated by the authorities responsible for the well-being of the biotic community. Any form of hunting that violates these laws, whether through poaching or through excessive taking of game, is not only illegal, it is immoral.
Yeah, I agree with that.
He argues then that the focus should be, I'm going to read another because he's pretty good at this. He talks about the idea that he believes that the consumption of meat should be primary. So when should you ever kill an animal you're not going to eat? Well, his argument is when it's for the good of the biotic community. Right.
So like you have a big ranch, a big farm of grain, and you have wild hogs.
In theory, it's for the good of the biotic community. The truth is, of course, all that corn's probably going to go into somebody's feeders who are going to feed hogs somewhere else. But the point is, if you look at the poundage of corn that is consumed by hunters in Texas, I think it's more than the corn that is actually produced by Texas farmers. Wow. Don't hold me to that one. I haven't got the numbers on that yet, but I've seen the numbers close to it. Yes, so one of the arguments is that 70% of a feral hog herd could be eliminated, and that's what it would take to keep a feral hog herd at the same population. Now the question is, and Ted would argue, I believe, that if you killed that hog, you're responsible for eating it. Because you're taking a life. The only argument where you might not take, and he does explore this, might take an animal and not consume it, would be where that animal is not good traditionally for food, and it's for the good of biotic community. So you're not killing it to kill. For instance, somewhere over here is a coyote. Mm-hmm. Coyotes, is various studies on these, lead to high numbers of fawn predation, fawn mortality. So what you're doing is you're making a decision. You're saying that the white-tailed deer, which generally produce only at best 2 offspring per year and are desirable, more desirable than other things, yes, to increase the population or at least maintain the population of white-tailed deer, if I eliminate some of the predation on fawns, I can keep that population or increase it. So I kill the coyote. Now the question is, do you kill the coyote and let it lay? Or do you take that which you can from it?
Like what? Are there coyote backstraps?
There aren't.
Yeah.
But you can take the fur. You can take the fur.
You can take the fur.
Sure. So when my argument is that we should not kill without cause. That cause should be well thought out.
Yeah.
And like Ted argues, it should be in conjunction with, parallel with, congruous with the best knowledge that we have, as well as what we argue what is moral, what is good, and hopefully what is good not just for us, but for God's creation.
Right.
If we're killing to kill, if we're killing for prestige, if we're killing as a signaling device, mm-hmm, you're doing it wrong.
Or for maybe sort of a sadistic thrill.
Oh, then definitely off.
Yeah.
Definitely off the charts.
Yeah.
So now that may be legal. You can go to a high fence, mm-hmm, Texas ranch, and shoot 160, 170, 180 point buck, something bigger than that, and pay $15,000. Mm-hmm. You may or may not eat it. I guarantee most people that are paying that much money are not processing that meat. Somebody's handling that. They're going to tip. Oh, I bet they're not processing. I bet you somebody's guts it, quarters it, processes it, and or somebody put it in a freezer, their Yeti cooler, haul it then to a processor. They never touch it. They never get blood. Yeah. And that processor pays it. They get it back in nice little rolls and plastic.
Yep. But can we fault that? Is that bad?
Can they? I'm questioning.
I agree that they did it. They didn't put it in the grinder and grind it. But they took an animal and they ate it. They just kind of did it in a more yuppie way.
Right. I would say if they're consuming it, okay.
Yeah.
I would say.
I mean, if they
how many?
if they cut the cape and the antlers and left it in the field, that'd be pretty bad.
Oh, I'd say it'd be wrong.
Yeah, that's
Actually,
bad. But
so
if
people may ask why I have these things up here, and actually, I mean, if I could take the thing and show you, I mean, I've got a little.
Yeah.
You can see a little bit of a base of a deer
Mhm.
mountain up here.
Yeah.
I think, and I argue just in this kind of a footnote in the book, that keeping trophies, and trophies need not be defined trophies by someone else. They're a trophy to you.
Right.
Trophies are sacramental.
Yeah.
So what I mean by that is
that's how I see it when people come in like, whoa, what's that animal on the wall?
Yeah.
And then I tell them, oh, that was down in South Texas, and
you start to tell a what?
I tell them the story. I was with my dad and my brother, and I tell them the whole thing. Like, wow, it's incredible, and what's it taste like? And I tell them what it tastes like, and yeah, and that animal was honored.
Yeah. No, it's more than that. The animal's alive.
Yeah, it's made present.
Exactly. That's what I mean. It's sacramental. It's just like, for instance, we tell the story at the Eucharist, if you will.
Yeah.
We remind ourselves what's going on. And in that moment of reception, and the retelling of the story on the night that Christ, you go through the whole thing, that is made immediate to you, and you are transformed. You're changed. Yeah. The retelling of it reminds you who you belong to, that is God, who you belong with, that is your fellow Christians, and then what you're supposed to be doing. For me, the trophy can be, it is not always, can be sacramental in that. And that is just as Christ is alive for us in that moment, transforming us in the Eucharistic power. Just like the waters of baptism can be, again, you don't have to be sacramental in your theology, but still are transforming and remind us who we are.
Yeah.
So that trophy can remind us who we are, what it is, and it lives again if it's treated respectfully and not as an other, as a thing, as an object.
Yeah.
I think that's powerful.
Yeah.
And should be done. And you should share your meat. I think the game dinners that Christians do can be a spectacular and sacramental event.
Yeah.
Because they're not wasting.
Nope.
They're sharing what's given to them. They tell the stories. The animal lives again.
It's healthy. Waste. It's healthy food, unless it was just living under a corn feeder. But it's out there. It's not getting annual injections or brands. It's not getting a tag in its ear. It's not eating any hormones or antibiotics. It's a wild animal. It is how it's supposed to be and how it's supposed to taste. That's beautiful.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I think that celebration of life, particularly if Christians do it together.
Yeah.
Whether it's around a family table. I love to cook for my classes. I teach hunting classes. Mm-hmm. And part of the ritual is I have them come over, and most of them have never hunted. Yeah. And I cook them things they've never tasted before. Yeah. And I tell them the stories if they want to hear them, and I try to, just a little bit. Yeah. Or drone on. They have to listen to me all the other time. But they participating, I'm sharing, and I feel the most complete, not when I'm cooking my own steak, but when I'm cooking for someone else. I'm sharing that meat. Now, don't get me wrong. Still want my freezer to be packed for me so that I have food throughout the year. But that sharing is, I think, something that is natural and part of God's plan. Again, but they didn't have freezers. Right. And it's something that can be a tool. Some see it as for evangelization. Mm-hmm. But I can see that as another way to understand not just who Christ is for you, but who and what we can become together. Yeah. A reminding of identification. And stories and trophies. Trophies are part of it. Right. And it's not just simply, look what I got. Yeah. I mean, I still have the antlers of the first deer I killed, an anemic little Missouri buck. Yep. But the story is what makes that very anemic 7-point buck valuable. Yeah.
And it's kind of like, would you ever put a mounted trophy on your wall that wasn't yours, that you got at a garage sale? I don't think I would. I don't know the story. I don't know the story.
Yeah. I've seen them.
Yeah.
In the stores.
I'm not interested in that. I just have, the 7-foot rattlesnake that almost killed me, and my first mule deer, and all these things that have these great stories, and the meat's gone. Well, the meat's in me. Meat's in my kids.
Right.
But I think there's something wholesome and good about it, and I think we've spent a lot of time going through the scriptures and seeing this kind of remarkable relationship between humankind and animal kind, and from the very first page of Genesis all the way into Acts, Peter, Revelation, it's all there. So, Dr. Hill, thanks. This was great. This is really wonderful.
Pleasure.
Now, I'm
Thank
sure after watching all this, people are going to want to read your book. So, again, the title is God, Nimrod, and the World, Exploring Christian Perspective on Sport Hunting, and available on Amazon. I'm sure we'll put a link to it in the show notes for this podcast. Anything else you want to share? Anything else?
No, it's fantastic experience. Thank you.
Well, thanks for being on, and maybe we could do it again sometime.
Whenever.
All right. God bless. Thanks.
All right. Thank you very much.